The Byzantine synthesis. As a history of the synthesis between these two lines of development in the Ordo, the history of the Typicon falls naturally into two periods. If the rule of prayer at the end of the 3rd century is taken as the point of departure for this process, then the first period extends from the 4th to the 9th centuries. And the second from the 9th down to the present. The first period was a time when both types of worship, parish and monastic, developed simultaneously, the period of their gradual merging and influence upon one another. This process may be regarded as complete by the 9th century. The second period is a time of the development of the Ordo within an already completed synthesis, and of the conflict and interaction between its different variants. This division into periods can be found in every history of the Ordo. However, historians of the Typicon usually concentrate all their attention on the second period, and this is because written evidence in the form of complete texts of the Ordo have been preserved only from this period. We know very little about the first era, which, in the words of Skabalanovich, was the most decisive period in the formation of our liturgical Ordo. Information concerning the extensive activity of that period, he writes, is very meager, falling far short of what we know from the periods preceding and following. As far as our own work is concerned, it is just this period which is of special interest, insofar as the synthesis of the original Christian lex orandi with the new emphasis of liturgical piety and their digestion by the mind of the Church occurred during this time. While granting the necessarily hypothetical character of our general presentation, we shall therefore concentrate our attention on this period of the formation of the Byzantine synthesis. If we were to take everything out of the Typicon that was introduced into it after the 9th or 10th centuries, during the era of its finalized form and structure, it would not be difficult to do this, since this process of accumulation is rather well documented in the numerous manuscripts which have been preserved. The three basic strata would remain corresponding to the three concepts or views of the rule of prayer, which we have been analyzing. There would be, first, the Ordo which arose out of the synagogal and Judeo-Christian foundations of the Christian cult. Second, there would be those elements which are connected with the new liturgical piety of the parish church and are rooted in the new relationship of church and world created by the conversion of Constantine. There would be, finally, the monastic stratum. The problem of the historian is to define each of these layers separately and also to discover their interrelationship within the final synthesis, within one design or ordo. The problem is a difficult one, since the whole significance of this Byzantine synthesis is that these three layers were not simply linked to one another in some kind of mechanical unity, but transformed within a genuine synthesis, changed in accordance with a general design, a general theology of the Ordo. The problem has not yet been resolved, and this has deprived both the historical and the theological study of the Ordo of all perspective. 1. The first stratum, the pre-Constantinian Ordo. First, then, there is the question of the early Christian or pre-Constantine layer of the Ordo. In the most general terms, this question can be formulated as follows. What elements in the Church's contemporary rule of prayer must be traced back to this fundamental layer? In the chapter devoted to the origin of the Ordo, we have tried to demonstrate the source of the very idea of Ordo, i.e. of structure, order. The idea of structure and order in the fundamental lex orandi, and also to show the general connection between this order and the liturgical traditions of the synagogue. Now we can make this description more detailed, on the basis of texts from the 3rd century, when the liturgical life of the early church can be regarded as rather well defined, and the factors related to the crisis of the 4th century had not yet begun to have their effect. Our brief analysis will fit naturally into the scheme already familiar to us. the 3 cycles of the liturgy of time, and then their relationship with the Eucharist as the sacrament of the Church. The daily cycle. Two basic services in the worship of the daily cycle have special significance: Vespers and Matins. Both undoubtedly originated in the pre-Constantine layer of the Ordo, not only because of their place in the general order of worship, but also because of their liturgical structure. We now know much more about the original substance of these services than was known in the time of Duchesne and Battefolle. The methods of comparative liturgics have helped us, together with the ever-deepening study of the synagogue worship. In the words of Hansen's, author of one of the more recent studies of the history of Matins, the theory concerning the monastic and local origin of these services in the 4th century must be regarded as inadmissible. In our present order for Vespers and Matins, 3 basic elements, which in combination from their order must be traced back to this original layer. There are A, the chanting of psalms, B, eschatological material, and C, hymns. These 3 elements stem in one way or another from the worship of the synagogue. What was borrowed from the synagogue was first the very principle of the liturgical use of the Psalter. The liturgical use of the Psalter, with its divisions into separate psalms and their habitual use at set times in worship. We may assume also that certain groups of psalms were borrowed, for example, the use of psalms of praise at Matins, which was one of the most widespread customs, in the words of A. Baumstock, the father of comparative liturgics. From the evidence of early texts, the morning and evening worship of the Church developed around certain psalms or groups of psalms. At Matins there was the morning psalm, Psalm 63. At Vespers, the evening psalm, Psalm 141. To these could be added the psalms of praise. At Matins, the lamp-lighting psalms. Psalms of praise Psalms of praise 148, 149, and 159 at Matins, and the lamp-lighting psalms 15, 142, 132, and 130 at Vespers. These psalms still form an unchanging part of the daily cycle. As for the way in which these psalms were used, there is still no agreement between the defenders of the theory of the musical dependence of the early church on the synagogue, and those who think that the psalms and the prophets were originally read and only later, at the beginning of the 3rd century, in the struggle against Gnostic hymnography, became the church's song. There can be no doubt, however, about... there's still no agreement, and those who think became... there are those. And there are those who think that the Psalms and the prophets were originally read and only later, at the beginning of the 3rd century, in the struggle against Gnostic hymnography, became the church's song. There can be no doubt, however, about the existence of some form of psalmody as a basis for the daily office in the pre-Constantine Ordo. The layers also may be traced to the early Judeo-Christian worship. In the contemporary Ordo, both the morning and the twilight prayers have become secret and are read by the officiant one after another during the reading of the Psalter. But it is plain from their text that they were related originally to the particular moments in worship, and actually alternated with the psalms and hymns. Their rubrics and early manuscripts give evidence of this usage. Prayer of the 50th Psalm, prayer at the praises, etc. In content, these prayers were close to the tefillah, the intercessory prayers of the synagogue worship, which points to their early inclusion in the ordo of the daily offices. The Syrian Didaskalia and other texts connected with it refer to these prayers as an important part of these offices. Intercessory prayers of the synagogue worship. In St. Paul, we find mention of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And this list, in the words of E. Welles, is understood uniformly now by every student of comparative liturgics. These 3 groups correspond to 3 kinds of singing usually found in Byzantine ritual. They originate in the Hebrew worship of the synagogue, which the disciples of Christ attended daily. A list of the first hymns used in the church has been preserved in an Alexandrian codex of the 5th century. But there are good grounds for believing that they were used in Christian worship even before Constantine. This list includes our present Old Testament songs, which later formed the canon, and also the Great Doxology. The Song of Simeon, the Great Doxology, the Song of Simeon, the God Receiver, the Prayer of King Manasseh, etc. Using the comparative method, Baumstark shows the gradual formulation of this early hymnological tradition, in which the Song of the Three Children represents, in his opinion, the original element. What is important for us here is simply the fact that there were hymns in the ordo of the earliest daily offices. As far as the term spiritual songs is concerned, in Wellis's opinion, these are chants of the melismatic type, of which the Alleluia is a major form. It is clear to anyone familiar with the order of our worship today that our present use of Alleluias clearly suggests that they had a greater significance in ancient times. Here, too, we can establish the connection with the synagogue tradition. It is demonstrated, for example, in the musical structure of the Alleluias of the Ambrosian liturgy, the earliest form of Alleluia which has come down to us. I'm actually curious about that. To this list of the primitive elements of Matins and Vespers, we must also add one: the undoubtedly liturgical character of these services. Both the Didascalia and the Apostolic Constitutions, in their descriptions of these services, invariably mention a leading person, an officiant, and both clergy and people, i.e. the pleroma of the church. These were not private prayers, therefore, but liturgical actions performed by the church and in the name of the church. And two, their structure and similarity to the first part of the Eucharistic assembly. Their structural similarity to the first part of the Eucharistic assembly, the Liturgy of the Word, the Pre-Anaphora, which supports Dugmore's conjecture that these services, constructed on the pattern of the synagogue worship, formed the first part of the Eucharist on the days of its celebration, and on the days were and on other days were independent offices. That's very interesting. In our present study, it is not too important to us whether these services were conducted in all places and at all times in the first centuries of Christianity. For example, the words "every day in the morning and evening" were inserted into the Didascalia by the compiler of the Apostolic Constitutions at the end of the 4th century. What is important is their general similarity to the cult of the synagogue, pointing to their very early acceptance by the Church, and also the universality of their basic pattern, which has been clearly demonstrated by specialists in the field of comparative liturgics. The weekly cycle. There can be no doubt whatever about the existence of the weekly cycle, the Eucharistic cycle of the Day of the Lord, and the earliest layer of the liturgical tradition. We should make some brief mention here of two questions which have so far not received adequate answers. These are the questions of the liturgical character of the Sabbath and the daily reception of communion. In the East, at the end of the 3rd century, the Eucharist was celebrated not only on the day of the resurrection, but also on Saturday, and Saturday preserves this liturgical character even now in the Orthodox liturgical ordo. Opinions of scholars differ on the explanation of this fact. Skabalonovich believes that the tendency to celebrate Saturday, celebrate Saturday on par with Sunday arose only at the beginning of the 3rd century, as a result of the gradual weakening of the anti-Jewish feeling among Christians. But in the opinion of other scholars, the development of Saturday simply continued the Judeo-Christian tradition in Eastern churches, a tradition discarded at an early date in the West. We repeat, this question deserves special study. In the meantime, the second hypothesis seems more probable and to correspond more nearly to the early Christian theology of time. It should be remembered that Judeo-Christianity, in the broad sense of this term, as it is used, for example, by Father Danilou in his Theology of Judeo-Christianity, was not at all a sort of spiritual Judeophilism. Thus, the Epistle of Barnabas is not only a memorial of the anti-Jewish polemic, but also a memorial of Judeo-Christianity, i.e., of Christianity expressed in the language and concepts of Judentum. We have spoken of the correlation of the 8th day, or the first day of the week, with the 7 days ending with Saturday within the Judeo-Christian tradition. It can hardly be doubted that the Judeo-Christian communities continued to celebrate Saturday as a holy day, above all as a commemoration of the creation. 18. The text of Irenaeus of Lyons, Origen's picture of the Sabbath, is strangely reminiscent of the best rabbinic teaching on the subject. In the West, there was no fast on Saturday before the 3rd century. The joining of this holy day with the celebration of the Eucharist was probably not something which happened at the very beginning, but it occurred naturally under the influence of the view of the Eucharist itself as a festival, and was possibly a reaction against the overly Judaized Christians. An echo of this view of the Saturday Eucharist can be found in one of the memorials of the Ethiopian Church, a memorial from a later date, of course, and yet in view of the centuries-old isolation of the Abyssinian Christianity, one which probably reflects a rather early tradition. In the Confession of Claudius, king of Ethiopia, it is said, "We observe it, Saturday, not as the Jews, who drink no water and kindle no fire on this day, but we observe it by celebrating the Lord's Supper and the Feast of Love, as our fathers, the apostles, commanded us, and it is prescribed in the Didascalia. But we also preserve it not as the festival celebration of the first day, Sunday, which is a new day, of which David spoke, 'This is the day the Lord has made, let us rejoice and be glad in it.' The liturgical observation of Saturday could hardly have grown out of local and later customs. It is more reasonable to suppose that it reflects the early Christian theology of the week, which began to pale after the Lord's Day was naturalized and returned to the time of this world as a day of rest." Interesting.